Mr. President, you got to drive this?
Let me tell you, this was one of the highlights of my time on this farm, was getting behind the wheel of this mean machine.
This is 1960, Bruce, right?
1960 vet.
And how old were you when you got this?
25.
And what did this mean to your life when you bought it?
Everything.
Everything.
Because it was all I got out of my record deal when I was 25 years old was this car, and I got a piano.
Well, we're gonna try this out. Where's the key? Come on, Bruce. I will confess that the Secret Service, normally I'm good about alerting them, but...
You just took off?
Yeah, I just took off, and in the rearview mirror, I could see some of my agents running behind. It's time for us to go.
A rock star and a former president hitting the road. If it looks like a buddy movie, well, it's kind of become one.
This friendship started really in 2008.
You know, Bruce Springsteen decided to charitably help out some not very well-known new U.S. senator who had the audacity to run for president.
Come on up for the rising.
Over time, that friendship deepened.
I am the president, he is the boss.
In 1969, I was a 19-year-old kid playing in a bar in Asbury Park the night they landed on the moon.
And in 2020, they sat down together for a couple of days here at Springsteen's New Jersey farm to talk about their lives and our world.
I look back on, we were all idiots at the time.
Those conversations became a podcast, and then the book, Renegades, Born in the USA.
You described the two of you as a little simpatico.
I think Bruce, through his music, I tease him about how much better it is being a rock and roll star than being a politician.
Which, of course, it is.
and he
do have the better deal.
He does not really deny it. There is a certain sense of ministry to Bruce's music, and his body of work is around these issues of who are we?
That's the question.
And what's important.
We came here tonight because we want to build a house.
What I do on any given evening, when I'm doing my job well, is I create a space of common values and shared narrative. For 3 hours, we create that place. It exists somewhere.
And when we build that house, we're going to use the bad wood. And we're going to use the good news that's in here tonight.
And that power of storytelling is, at its best, what good politics does as well, right? It says, here's who we are, here's a common story we share. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue scattered across 3 continents. And for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. You get a lot of nostalgia sometimes for 50s and Leave It to Beaver and Picket Fences. And that was a genuine shared story, except it left a whole bunch of stuff out.
And a lot of people out.
People like me were left out. I think where Bruce and I sort of overlap is that sense of it was necessary to revise the story, to make it inclusive.
People have got to recognize the country for what it is, its faults, its blessings.
One thing that's interesting, I think a lot of people would look at this and go, what's a guy from Hawaii and a guy from New Jersey, black guy, white guy, what have they got in common? Right. You both see yourselves as outsiders. You talk about feeling invisible growing up here.
It might be the story of all artists and musicians that you start from the outside. When I was young, I felt voiceless. I felt invisible. But I fought to find out where I belonged.
I joked with Bruce. I said, well, I don't understand why a kid from New Jersey thinks he's an outsider, because now I'm an outsider. You can definitely understand why Barack Obama is the outsider. What I do think we both shared was that sense of having questions about, well, how do we fit into the existing narrative? How do we fit into the communities that we're born into? Partly because, Bruce, you talked about your dad being sick. My dad was absent.
Well, you both talk about having essentially absentee fathers.
And I think that can contribute to that sense of feeling like, I don't know exactly how I'm supposed to behave or how I'm supposed to act.
Well, let me ask you this, because you said something in the podcast, Bruce, that really struck me, which was that in many ways, your work was really about your father.
The more I look back on it, the more that's the conclusion I come to.
What were you doing in that?
Well, in a sense, we'll try to be him. I try to create a physical self that I thought he would approve of, have a success that I thought he would approve of. But I also felt a certain sort of, that I was an instrument of revenge for the disappointments that my father had in his life. And so I started to intensely tell these working class stories that were filled with both. They were both hope and compassion, but a lot of anger also. And I think Barack had a very similar, why did you become president? Who were you trying to impress?
Well, that was my next question. Do you think in some way your father's absence drove your ambition?
Absolutely. Yeah, my father was absent. He left when I was 2. I met him only once, knew him for about a month.
That's interesting how influential that month turned out to be.
Well, that's right. I wrote a whole book called Dreams from My Father, a guy I didn't know. How unusual was it to have an integrated band back in the day?
In their podcast conversations, they touched on some tough subjects.
I think, why is it so hard to talk about race? Why am I pausing here?
For years, Springsteen's E Street Band featured Clarence Clemons, who died in 2011.
Big man, Clarence Clemons!
The chemistry between the big man and the boss is immortalized in newly restored footage of Springsteen's performance at the No Nukes concert at Madison Square Garden in 1979.
You say in the podcast, in the book, that in many ways the most important story you ever told was you and Clarence on the stage together.
It was not intellectual, it was emotional, it was the language of the heart, but it was incredibly visual. It was more valuable than the stories I wrote in my music, In
an ideal world, what Bruce and Clarence portrayed on stage was essentially a reconciliation, right?
Yeah.
And redemption.
That's right.
But most of your audiences were primarily white. And they can love Clarence when he's on stage, but if they ran into him in a bar, suddenly the N-word comes out.
Yeah.
And part of Bruce's music and part of my politics has been, no, you got to surface that stuff. You got to talk about it. Sunlight is the disinfectant, and if you talk about it, then you can reconcile in a true way, not in a phony way, but in a real way.
Looking forward, how are you feeling about the midterms and how the president is doing?
Well, look, I think Joe Biden is pursuing the exact policies that need to be pursued. Has he been able to bridge the polarization that we've seen building up over several decades now? No, and in fairness to him, I wasn't able to slow that down as much as I would have liked, and certainly my successor was, actively promoted it. We're going to have to figure out how do we regain some sense of a common American story, and I think that is going to be a longer-term project. I think that's a 10, 20-year process. It's a generational process. Yeah. The good news is that I think there is more of a common story among young people, but the older folks like us, we got to get out of the way. And so.
Yeah, there's no going back. We can be momentarily polarized, but at the end of the day, history's moving on. That's what I do. I'm an old man, but I can still do what I do.
He's got bills to pay.
It's a big farm.
And surprising things can happen. Just look at the friendship of Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen.
I think making friends as you get older in the later parts of your life is really rewarding. And it's a little bit rare.
Comes from a different place, too.
That's
really.
right.
Yeah.
And you don't want to end up being just a lonely old guys.
Oh, man. That's right.
That's the thing we're trying to avoid, right?
Right.
It's been a hell of a ride.
Life is good.
Life is good.